Hey, it's Garret Biss. Thank you very much for joining me today. So I'm really excited to come to you on a Facebook Live from a special and unique location. So my day today, I was traveling from New Bern, North Carolina down to Auburn, and with some unexpected delays, I've had the fortune of spending some extra time in the Charlotte airport and have the pleasure now doing a Facebook Live from the USO at the Charlotte airport. So things change in our life often, and we have to find ways to adapt and overcome and deal with the challenges or the situations that were presented. So I'm really excited to take that opportunity today and continue with this series of Facebook Live videos, specifically talking about the spheres approach. So we started a discussion yesterday, and I did a little bit of an introduction and talked about the backstory behind the spheres approach and the kind of the journey in my life that led me to writing the book and sharing that message. And then we talked a little bit about the relationships between thoughts and emotions and our physical body and how they all are interrelated and one affects the other. I'll talk a little bit more about that today. And then I took a moment and went through some definitions of what exactly the spheres approach is. So real quick recap on that. The spheres approach, I understand the world that we live in is comprised of three concentric spheres, so us individually. Everything that takes place around us happens in either the indirect sphere, meaning the things and events that occur in the world that don't directly affect us. But they can affect us if they affect our emotions and affect the thoughts that we have. Then it will affect the way that we feel and the way that we show up and the way that we tend to those things that are important in our life and are on our plate. The direct sphere then is everything that does directly affect us, those things that we must either react or respond to. And as we get more into the discussion about the spheres approach, we'll talk about ways that you can deal with everything in the direct sphere so that you can find a way to have it positively contribute to your life, find a positive or silver lining in it, or have it propel you forward on your path towards fulfillment and towards happiness instead of holding you back or creating undue obstacles in your way. And then lastly, the action sphere is everything that we can do that affects or influences the world around us, either through the things that we say, the actions that we take, or just the way that we show up in our environment. And I challenged you to think of things or look at anything in your life and identify whether something that's on your mind, something that might be bothering you, whether it's something that occurs in the direct sphere or the indirect sphere. And when you can identify things that are in the indirect sphere, then you can regain any energy, any time that was thought or spent thinking about those things or being bothered by those things, and reinvest that time and energy in those things that are on your plate, those things that matter most, and those things in your direct sphere which you would like to invest your time and energy in. So today I want to delve a little bit more into the indirect sphere and really why it's so important to understand when things are happening in the indirect sphere and realizing that they are only indirectly affecting us, so that we can recapture or regain that time and attention that we have. Things that happen around us, things that we hear about on the news, things that don't directly affect our life. For one, it can affect the energy that we have. When we're constantly bombarded with things that are negative, that are going on in the world around us, it can affect the way that we feel, the way that we show up. And one of the ways that it affects us, one of the functions of our brain, or one of the ways that things that are in our indirect sphere can affect us is this function in our brain, this thing that we have called mirror neurons. And what mirror neurons are is what they do essentially in our body is they replicate or create emotional responses in our body to react to things that we see taking place with other people. And one way I love to demonstrate this when I'm doing a live workshop or a presentation is when I'm talking about mirror neurons, I'll put a short video clip on of some like accidents or hard football hits or something where somebody on the screen is being affected in a certain way, and the way the audience responds when you see somebody who is going to get hit, who's playing a football game and it's a really hard hit. Well, when you see that, you always cringe up, and it affects you because like your body, you have an emotional response to that, even though there's no doubt in your mind that whatever that event is, it's not happening to you. It still creates an instantaneous emotional response in you. Because of these mirror neurons, when we see people, it really fuels the compassion and connection that we have with others, and they work to a really good purpose in our lives with building connections and helping us foster relationships with others. But they can be a hindrance when we're affected by or influenced by negatively influenced by things that take place around us that don't directly affect us. If we continue to, you see this when you go to the movies. If you see something on the movie screen, hello, Mr. Noah. I see that Noah says, hi, Mr. Garrett. So wonderful to have you and Leanne on checking this out. Great to see you. One time that our mirror neurons really affect us, an experience that you have likely had, is when you go to the movie theater and you're watching a movie on the big screen. Like, there's no doubt in your mind, you paid for the ticket, you walk in the movie theater, you sit down, they dim the lights, without any question that what you're seeing on the screen is something that's fictitious. It might be based on a true story, but it's still something that not only is not happening at the present time, but then nothing on the screen is influencing you. But if we go see a good scary movie, it can really influence the emotions that we have, the sensations that we have in our mind. When Freddy's running down the street trying to hurt somebody, we get those same sensations, even though there's no question in our mind that those things aren't happening to us. Well, when things in the world that occur in our indirect sphere, when we're aware of them, even if they're not directly happening to us or affecting us, it still can affect the emotions that we have, the thoughts that we have, and our ability to show up and tend to those things that are important. And it's because of these mirror neurons that, that's one major pathway or one major way that these things can affect us. So when we can identify those things that are happening in our indirect sphere and realize that it's not happening to us, then we can regain that time and attention and focus on those things that are most important. And it's really because we have these emotion responses. Emotions affect the thoughts that we have, and then the thoughts that we have, they really define or build the context for and create our perception, and our perception of reality, or our perception of things going on around us. And one of the ways that it does this is when we have certain thoughts, or when we have certain beliefs about either the way that the world works around us or the way that things are happening in our life. When we have a certain belief, then we make the assumption that belief is true. And then as we examine the world around us, as we see things taking place around us, we look for evidence that supports that assumption. Well, there's this phenomenon called confirmation bias, which says that when we are seeking evidence, or the evidence that we see, the things that we see around us, we're more biased to only see the things that satisfy or fulfill or are in alignment with a thought or a belief that we have. So if we're influenced, the thoughts that we have influence our perception, because when we're having certain thoughts, we make assumptions about how the world is, how the world operates, how things are transpiring in our life. And then our perception of the world around us is filtered by this confirmation bias, because we'll now see those things that support those assumptions, see those things that support these assumptions that things might not be going well in our life, or things might not be going in the world around us. And we ignore or downplay or completely disregard any evidence to the contrary. So this can be really dangerous when it can create us, getting into a downward spiral where we believe things are stacked against us, because we'll hear something, we'll feel something, we'll see something. It will suggest to us that life is a certain way, that life is operating a certain way. And then we'll only see evidence that supports that assumption. So if it's an assumption that works against us, then we're going to see evidence that supports that assumption, which is going to stimulate new thoughts, which will then fuel more emotions. So this emotional spiral will be a downward spiral of things that are hampering our progress towards committing that time and energy to those things that we want, and hampering our progress towards the happiness and fulfillment that we're seeking with the things that we do and the things that we engage. So all of this really just lays this, is a discussion about how the thoughts that we have affect our emotions. The emotions that we have affect our physical body. A way that I'd like to talk about this a lot is referring to ourself, each individual, as a trinity, or a trinity of self is usually the way that I describe it. And the trinity of ourself that I'm talking about is we have our conscious mind, which where our thoughts reside, our unconscious or preconscious mind, which is think of your emotional state, and then your physical body. And all three of these are interconnected and interrelated, because the physical body, the way that we're feeling physically, can affect the emotions. If you've ever gotten up in the morning and you're feeling sick, or you're feeling exhausted, well, that affects the emotions that you have. And those emotions that you have can influence the thoughts that you have. If you're in a depressed state, if you're in an anxious state, it will affect the thoughts that you have. But our thoughts can also affect our emotions. When we continue to have negative thoughts repeating in our mind, that can drive up or drive down our emotional state. And the emotions that we have when we are depressed, a lot of times we're more lethargic. It affects our physical body or our physical state. So I always understood that there were some connections between our emotions, our thoughts, and our physical body, but I didn't realize there's a couple pathways or a couple ways that these are interrelated that I wasn't really familiar with, and really kind of surprised me. So one of the things I learned is that our physical body can affect our emotions, but it's not, but it's something that we can manipulate. So I was taking some improv classes, and I learned that one of the things actors do to influence their emotional state and the way that they can perform in a certain role is they'll stand in certain positions that would stimulate a certain emotion. So not only, like, if you're depressed and you're in a negative emotional place, we tend to slouch our shoulders, we tend to look down, we tend to, if you look at somebody's feet, their feet tend to be pointed more towards one another. Well, what's interesting is if you were to stand in that position for long enough, you can manipulate your emotional state. And similarly, if you were to stand in a way that would exude confidence, the way that you would feel if you were, in a good place, if you were optimistic, if you were to stand in that position for long enough, it would affect your emotional state. There was one really fascinating video by, I believe it's Amy Cuddy, it's a TED Talk, where she talks about, using stances to manipulate your emotional state and your state of mind. So when I realized this, that, it's not just a one-way pathway, if you will, from your emotions to your physical, but it's really a closed loop system. So if you were to manipulate the physical, it then affects your emotions. So, and then something more recently that I've discovered and started learning about is our physical body's ability to affect our emotions. A lot of times we think that we have an emotion and then we respond in a certain way. So like we might have an emotion of sadness, and then our physical body responds by crying. We might have an emotion of anger, and then our physical body or physiology responds in a certain way and might commit a certain action. But there's a lot of research that shows recently that a lot of times we have a physical action, we take a physical action, and that's what creates the emotion. So it might not be the emotion of sadness that creates the crying, but also the act of crying can create that emotional sadness that we feel. So it's really fascinating how all these things are interrelated, but I only bring that up to talk about and to express why we talk about the thoughts that we have so often. Because if you can influence or affect your thoughts, then you can manipulate your physical state and your emotional state. But if all three are interconnected, if the whole Trinity is interconnected and any one can influence the other, then we can focus our time and attention on the things that's most easy to manipulate. And in a lot of applications, we find that our thoughts are the most easy thing to manipulate. At any moment, we can think of a certain thought, and we can change that thought if we wanted to. If I asked you to think of a green elephant right now, then you could close your eyes, you could visualize, or you could just think of a green elephant. If I were to then ask you to think of, a purple orange, well, you could manipulate your thoughts and you could think of a purple orange, and just like that, you can change that thought that you're having. Sometimes we have a hard time keeping our thoughts on the train that we want to, but we have the ability to change those thoughts very quickly. And if we can change our thoughts and focus on the thoughts that we have and how we can change our thoughts, well, then we can manipulate the emotions that we have and our physical state. So that's why I talk about thoughts a lot and their ability to affect everything else. Emotions, one of the reasons that it's so important to understand our emotions and understand how we get into a negative emotional place and understand the things that we can do to get out of that place is because emotions, negative emotions, linger so much longer than the positive emotions that we have. One of the ways I love to demonstrate this, and one way that you can kind of, an example that you can see yourself, or a way that you can experience this yourself, is with a piano. So one of the things I love to do during a live presentation is striking the keys on a piano. And you'll notice if you strike the highest pitched key on a piano, it lets out a very loud noise, and it's very high pitch, but it dissipates very, very quickly. Whereas if you went and you struck the lowest key on the piano and you held it down, you would just hear it reverberate for a very long period of time. Well, in some not very scientific studies, I did this many, many times, and I timed it to see how much longer that negative chord, that negative or that low sound would reverberate. And from what I get, it's about 8 to 12 times longer than the high pitch ones. And I realize that there seems to be a lot of correlation there between the negative emotions that we have and the positive ones. When you're having a great day or something awesome happens in your life, or you feel in a really good place, you might have something that stimulates that joyful experience, that joyful emotion. But very quickly, within minutes, hours, or days, that emotion will fade and we'll get kind of back to our normal set point. But if something tragic happens in your life or something bad happens in your life, you experience a major failure or you have a major setback, the emotional repercussions from that can linger for much, much longer. Sometimes people have an experience, you're fired from a job, have a breakup, face some kind of challenge, get some bad news, and the depression that can create, that negative emotion that can create, lasts so much longer than those positive emotions. So that's why I think it's so important to understand what leads us into negative emotions and experiencing the negative emotions, and more importantly, having the tools and the ability to pull ourselves out of that place when we experience it. Because if we just wait for it to naturally pass, it can take so much longer. And if you're looking at the correlation between the piano, or the example of the piano, 8 to 12 times as long for the natural course of that negative emotion to pass. So really, this is just more of a discussion on why it's so important to understand and to protect ourselves from those negative things that happen in the indirect sphere, and how we can do that, and really setting the stage for how we'll do that in future discussions by influencing and affecting the thoughts that we have, by being able to change the thoughts that we have to see things from a more positive light and have positive thoughts even about seemingly negative things that happen in our life, because this will empower us to influence the emotions. And by affecting our thoughts and our emotions, it will set us up and empower us to act in the way that we want, and act from a more positive place, and take those actions that we need to make the changes in our life that we want. So I really appreciate you joining me today. If you wanted to do some more, or learn a little bit more about how your physical state affects your emotions, when I mentioned there's research that shows that if you were to cry, that's what would create the sadness. Or if you were to, punch something in rage, that's what would create the rage. It's not necessarily the emotion that precedes the action. There's some research by William James, who was an MD studied at Harvard. And he was a medical doctor, and now he studies psychology, and he wrote a book called The Principles of Psychology, where he talks about those relations. And if you want to see that TED Talk or that video, Amy Cuddy, Cudy, I believe, does the TED Talk, where she talks about taking certain stances to create emotional responses in your body. Thank you very much for joining me. If you have any questions or any comments about managing your spheres, or about how these things have shown up in your life, or maybe tricks that you've come up with or learned that help you manage your emotions or your thoughts, then I'd love to hear your comments. And if you're not watching the live one, you can still leave your comments on this post. I'll repost it. And if you have any questions about things that you'd like to talk about here or in future videos, and please, by all means, you can share those as well, either direct message, email, or just leave a comment. If you want to read ahead a little bit or learn a little bit more about applying the spheres approach in your life, you can grab a copy of the book. It's on Amazon if you want, or if you want a signed copy, you can reach out to me and I'll find some way to get it to you. But if you learn anything helpful in this video, then I invite you to share it with other people, and invite your friends to come like the page so that they can be included on future videos. But you have an awesome day. If you're in Eastern North Carolina, be safe with the weather, and look forward to chatting with you soon.